Daniel Mercer stood in the gravel parking lot of Ashford Wool Mill with $455 in cash in the kind of desperation that makes careful men reckless. The building rose 4 stories against the Maine sky, its granite walls stained dark by a century of coal smoke and lanolin, and every shattered window reflected October clouds moving fast enough to remind him that winter was coming and he had nowhere to go. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. His son Ethan sat in their car, 7 years old and silent in the way children become when they've watched their parents lose everything and learn that asking questions only makes the worry visible. The county tax auction had lasted 13 minutes. Daniel had been the only bidder willing to take on a condemned wool mill with structural violations, environmental contamination, and the kind of history that made insurance companies refuse coverage outright. $455, the auctioneer had announced with the apologetic tone of someone selling a liability disguised as property, going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman who clearly hasn't consulted an engineer or his sanity. Daniel had withdrawn his last $500 from the bank that morning, kept $45 for gas and food, and gambled the rest on a building that everyone in 4 counties knew was worthless. His landlord had given him 2 weeks to clear out of the apartment after the paper mill laid him off, said the unit was needed for someone who could actually pay rent. His applications to every factory and warehouse within driving distance had generated the kind of silence that felt louder than rejection, and his ex-wife's attorney had sent another notice about child support arrears that Daniel kept in his glove box because reading it made his chest tight. The wool mill had appeared in the legal notices between foreclosure announcements and equipment sales. County seizure for delinquent taxes, minimum bid $400, property conveyed as is with all structural defects, environmental liabilities, and historical baggage. Daniel had driven past it twice before gathering the nerve to walk the perimeter, Ethan working on reading homework in the passenger seat while his father studied a building that looked like it was held together by rust and regret. The structure had good bones, Daniel told himself, which was what desperate men said about buildings that had nothing else. But the bones were real, load-bearing walls 5 feet thick at the base, timber beams from old-growth spruce that didn't exist anymore, and a foundation that had withstood 100 years of Maine winters without surrendering to frost heave. The roof was failing, the windows were gone, and the interior was almost certainly toxic with chemical residues and mold. But it was space, more square footage than Daniel had ever owned, and with enough work it might become something that generated income, storage maybe, workshops, anything that wasn't sleeping in their car. "Dad, it smells weird," Ethan said as Daniel worked the key the county clerk had given him, a man who'd processed his payment with the efficient sympathy of someone who'd watched too many broke people throw money at impossible properties. "Old wool and machine oil," Daniel said, though the smell was more complex than that, lanolin gone rancid, dyes crystallized on every surface, and organic matter that had been decaying in sealed spaces for decades. The door opened onto a loading dock where farmers had once delivered raw fleece, wooden pallets still stacked against walls marked with grease stains and decades of accumulated grime. The main floor stretched into shadows that swallowed his flashlight beam after 20 feet. Equipment rose like monuments to obsolete industry, carting machines the size of trucks, their drums crusted with ancient wool fiber, spinning frames that looked like mechanical forests, and weaving looms that traced paths through the space in patterns that spoke of efficiency refined over generations. Wool scraps littered the floor, compressed into felted mats that cracked under his boots. "Can we live here?" Ethan asked, his voice carrying that particular quality children develop when they know the answer but need to hear their parents say it anyway. "Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it's ours." Daniel played his light over abandoned workstations, noting details that told stories of the building's last days. Time cards still hung in racks near what must have been the foreman's station, names and punch times marking shifts that ended when the mill closed in 1985. Safety goggles sat on a windowsill, their elastic rotted to powder. Work gloves lay scattered across machinery, stiff with chemical exposure and 40 years of temperature swings. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The second floor held the actual textile processing equipment, massive vats that had contained dye solutions and chemical treatments, washing stations that transformed raw fleece into finished yarn through processes that were equal parts craft and environmental violation. Daniel recognized some of it from his grandfather's stories, the old man who'd worked textiles his whole life and died with lungs full of wool dust, and stories about the great mills that had employed thousands before automation and overseas manufacturing killed them all. The third floor contained offices and design studios, spaces where the business of wool had been conducted. Sample books lined shelves, showing yarn weights and colors from decades past. Order ledgers displayed customer names and quantities that told the story of a once thriving operation. And on the wall in the largest office hung a photograph in a mahogany frame, a man in his 60s, dressed in the formal style of the 1930s, standing before the wool mill's entrance with one hand resting on a bale of raw fleece. The brass nameplate read, "Jonathan Ashford, founder and proprietor, 1879 to 1955. "Who's that?" Ethan asked, pointing at the severe-looking man whose expression suggested the absolute confidence that came from building something significant from nothing. "The person who started this place. A long time ago." Daniel explored further, finding stairs to what appeared to be executive offices on a mezzanine level overlooking the third floor. The largest belonged to Jonathan Ashford himself, a desk made from walnut that had survived better than anything else in the building, chairs upholstered in wool fabric that had faded but not disintegrated, and windows overlooking the Kennebec River that had provided water for the wool processing. The desk still held evidence of interrupted routine. A ledger lay open to pages filled with meticulous handwriting. A fountain pen sat in its holder, dried ink crusted at the nib. And on the wall behind the desk hung an oil portrait of the same man from the photograph, older here, perhaps in his 70s, painted with the gravity that successful industrialists commission to ensure their legacy would be remembered. "Dad, I'm hungry," Ethan said, tugging at his jacket. Daniel checked his phone, surprised to see they'd been inside for nearly 3 hours. The October afternoon was fading, and he needed to figure out where they'd sleep tonight since the apartment was already locked and the wool mill was legally uninhabitable. "Yeah, buddy. Let's go find something to eat." As he turned toward the door, his boot caught on something and he stumbled, catching himself against the desk. Looking down, he saw a floorboard that had come loose, revealing a cavity beneath. And in that cavity, barely visible in the failing light, was a metal case about the size of a briefcase, its surface engraved with wool motifs and the mill's logo. Daniel knelt and extracted it carefully, surprised by its weight. The case was sealed with a combination lock, but the mechanism was so corroded it opened with gentle pressure, revealing contents wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them from moisture and time. Inside was a leather journal, and tucked into its pages was a folded document that looked like architectural blueprints. The journal's first page bore a date, September 20th, 1954, and an inscription in the same meticulous hand as the ledger, "To whoever discovers this, I am Jonathan Ashford, proprietor of this mill and all its holdings. What you have found is merely the beginning of what remains concealed within these walls." The economic shifts and foreign competition destroyed many textile fortunes, but I learned from others' failures and kept my wealth close, hidden in ways that will require both persistence and insight to uncover. This building contains the accumulated profit of 75 years of operation, protected from taxation, creditors, and the grasping hands of those who did not earn it. I leave this journal as proof and invitation. The plans enclosed will guide you to treasures, but only if you possess the intelligence to interpret them correctly. Many will own this building after my death, but few will understand what it truly holds. May you prove worthy of the discovery. Jonathan Ashford. Daniel read the passage 3 times, his pulse accelerating with each reading. A textile magnate's hidden wealth, concealed within a building everyone assumed was worthless and contaminated. The case held only this journal and the blueprints, but if Ashford was telling the truth, there were actual treasures, valuable assets hidden somewhere in this structure. He unfolded the architectural blueprints, finding they showed the wool mill in remarkable detail, every floor, every room, every structural element documented with engineer's precision. Certain locations were marked with red ink, 9 of them total, each annotated with cryptic phrases and measurements. One notation read, where fleece first met water, the cornerstone remembers industry. Another said, in the carding drum's iron heart, beneath the primary cylinder, foundations hold secrets in silver. The clues were maddeningly vague and tantalizingly specific in equal measure. What is it? Ethan asked, peering at the journal with curiosity that hadn't yet been beaten down by their circumstances. Daniel looked at his son, at the jacket with patches covering holes, at the shoes held together with duct tape, at the trust in his eyes that said he still believed his father could fix things even when Daniel barely believed it himself. He thought about the $455 he'd just spent on a condemned building, about the 2 weeks until homelessness became official, about the arithmetic of single fatherhood that never quite added up to survival. And he thought about Jonathan Ashford, a man who'd built an empire on wool and textiles, who'd survived economic collapse by hiding wealth where others wouldn't think to look, who'd left a map for someone desperate or clever enough to follow. I think, Daniel said slowly, I just found a reason to believe we might actually make it. He returned the journal to the case and slipped it into his jacket, folded the architectural blueprints carefully and put them in his back pocket, and led Ethan back through the wool mill toward daylight. The building felt different now, not abandoned but dormant, like something waiting to reveal its secrets to someone who knew how to listen. Every shadow held possibility, every structural detail potential significance. They emerged into the parking lot as the sun touched the western hills, painting the Kennebec River in shades of copper and steel. Daniel looked back at the wool mill, at 4 stories of granite and history and supposedly hidden wealth, and felt something he hadn't experienced in months, hope mixed with fear in proportions that made his hands shake. His phone buzzed with a text from his ex-wife, Jennifer, asking when she could expect this month's support payment. He'd been avoiding her calls for 4 weeks, had no answer that wouldn't sound like excuses or lies. But standing in front of a building that allegedly contained a fortune, Daniel had something approaching a direction if not quite a plan. He texted back, soon. Working on something. Ethan climbed into the car, buckling himself with the automatic efficiency of a child who'd learned independence earlier than childhood should require, and Daniel sat in the driver's seat with Ashford's blueprints spread across the steering wheel. The architectural plans showed every detail of the wool mill's construction, and the red markings indicated locations throughout the building, each with its cryptic clue. One location referenced the loading dock where they'd entered. Another indicated the main processing floor. Several marked the basement, which Daniel hadn't even known existed. The clues suggested Ashford had hidden his wealth systematically, distributed throughout the structure in ways that would require searching, thinking, understanding the building's logic and the industry it had housed. Daniel started the car, knowing he needed to find them somewhere to sleep, but his mind was already working through the puzzle. A textile magnate's hidden fortune in a condemned wool mill, protected by riddles written in industrial language. It was insane. It was probably fantasy. It was exactly the kind of desperate gamble a broke father with a son to feed might be crazy enough to believe in. As he pulled onto the county road, Daniel made a decision that would define everything that followed. He would solve Jonathan Ashford's puzzle, find whatever the old magnate had hidden, and turn their impossible situation into something resembling stability. The wool mill had sold for almost nothing because everyone assumed it was worth exactly that. But Daniel knew better now. Sometimes the most valuable things were the ones everyone else had stopped looking for, hidden in plain sight by someone who understood that true wealth wasn't always visible on the surface. The building receded in his rearview mirror, for stories of possibility against the darkening Maine sky, and Daniel Mercer drove toward an uncertain night with a map to hidden treasure in his pocket and the weight of impossible hope settling in his chest like wool waiting to be spun into something that might, if he was careful and lucky and desperate enough, actually hold together. Daniel spent their first night in the wool mill illegally, spreading sleeping bags on the least contaminated section of the mezzanine office. Ethan curled against him while October wind whistled through broken windows and carried the smell of old wool and machine oil. The building groaned around them, timber contracting in the cold, ancient equipment settling under weight it had carried since before the Great Depression. Every sound made Daniel question whether he'd crossed from desperation into madness, but morning came anyway. Gray light filtering through grime-covered windows, and Ethan woke asking what was for breakfast with the resigned pragmatism of a child who'd learned that adults rarely had good answers anymore. They ate gas station donuts and drank water from a bottle Daniel had filled at a rest stop, and he studied Ashford's blueprints while Ethan explored the office with instructions not to touch anything sharp or unstable, which was essentially everything. The first marked location referenced where fleece first met water, the cornerstone remembers industry. Daniel knew enough about wool processing to understand that meant the washing area, the ground floor section where raw fleece had been cleaned before carding and spinning. The cornerstone was massive, carved granite inscribed with the mill's founding date and Ashford's name in letters that had weathered 80 years of Maine weather. Daniel examined it carefully, running his hands over the surface, searching for anything that felt loose or deliberately modified. The stone was solid, immovable, and after an hour of searching he found nothing except cold hands and the growing suspicion that he'd spent his last money chasing a dead man's fantasy. He was still searching when his phone rang, Jennifer's name on the screen. Daniel almost didn't answer, but avoiding her had never made anything better, only postponed the collision he knew was inevitable. "Where are you?" Jennifer's voice carried the particular edge she reserved for conversations about his failures. "I called your landlord. He says you moved out 4 days ago without notice." "We're fine. Found a place." "What place?" "Daniel, you're 6 months behind on support, you haven't had work since July, and now you've moved without telling me where my son is staying?" Her voice shifted, anger giving way to something that might have been actual fear. "I'm not trying to make your life harder. But you need to be realistic. If you can't provide stable housing, maybe Ethan should stay with me and Marcus for a while." The words hit like a punch to the sternum. Jennifer had remarried 9 months ago, moved into Marcus's house with its game room and its school district ranked in the state's top 10. She could provide everything Daniel couldn't: stability, resources, a future that didn't depend on finding a dead magnate's hidden fortune. And family courts favored stability, favored mothers, favored anything that looked more secure than a broke father sleeping in a condemned building. "No," Daniel said, the word coming out harder than he intended. "He stays with me." "Then prove you can take care of him. Stable housing, reliable income, proper schooling. You have 1 week, Daniel. After that, I'm filing for emergency custody modification." The call ended, and Daniel sat among the wool dust with 1 week to transform his life from desperate gamble into something that resembled responsible parenting. He could sell the wool mill, probably get a few thousand for the salvage rights and scrap metal, use that to rent something acceptable and buy time to find work. But selling meant giving up on Ashford's fortune, meant accepting that he'd spent his last dollars on nothing. He climbed back upstairs to find Ethan standing at a window, looking down at the parking lot where a Mercedes sedan had pulled in, expensive and incongruous against the wool mill's industrial decay. A man in his 70s emerged, well-dressed in the way that spoke of old money rather than new wealth, and stood examining the building with the careful attention of someone who knew what they were looking at. "Who's that?" Ethan asked. "I don't know." "Stay here." Daniel descended quickly, emerging from the wool mill's entrance as the man finished his inspection. He looked up when Daniel appeared, unsurprised, as if he'd been expecting to find someone. "You must be Mercer," the man said. "I'm Robert Ashford. Jonathan was my grandfather." Daniel's mind raced, calculating implications and threats. "I bought this property legally. County auction, paid in full." "I'm aware. I'm the one who stopped fighting the tax liens." Robert moved closer, his eyes scanning the building's facade with something that looked like complicated grief. "My family's been trying to divest this property for 40 years. Tax burden, environmental liability, structural violations that would cost millions to address. But my father, Jonathan's son, he always insisted we keep it. Said there were obligations, things that mattered, family responsibilities we couldn't ignore. He died 7 months ago, and I finally convinced my siblings to let it go. So what do you want?" "To know what you found." Robert gestured at the building, at the windows Daniel had been examining. "My grandfather was a brilliant industrialist and a complicated man. Built a fortune during the textile boom, supposedly lost it during the Depression, then somehow rebuilt through methods that were never entirely clear. Family stories about wealth hidden in the wool mill, assets secured against government seizure and creditor claims. But if they existed, we never found them. Searched this place exhaustively over the years, hired consultants, even brought in ground-penetrating radar. Nothing. Daniel kept his expression neutral. It's just an old wool mill. Broken equipment and chemical contamination. But not only that. Robert's expression hardened. I can see it in your posture, the way you're standing. You found something. And legally speaking, there's a legitimate question about whether assets deliberately hidden by the original owner to avoid taxation or creditor claims belong to the property's new purchaser or to the original owner's heirs. I bought the building and everything in it. That's how property sales work. Unless the assets were concealed with fraudulent intent or hidden in ways that suggest they weren't part of the property's inherent value. Robert pulled out his phone. I have attorneys who specialize in estate disputes and treasure trove law. We can do this cooperatively, split whatever you found, or we can do it through the courts while you explain to Child Protective Services why you're raising a child in a condemned building with environmental violations. The threat was clear, and Daniel felt the familiar rage that came from being cornered by people with more resources and better lawyers. But beneath the rage was calculation, the survivor's arithmetic he'd learned through years of barely managing. Your grandfather left a journal, Daniel said finally. Hidden in his office. Locations marked throughout the building where he stored valuables. I haven't found anything yet except the journal itself. Robert's careful composure cracked slightly, showing hunger beneath the practiced neutrality. Show me. They climbed to the mezzanine office, Ethan watching warily from the corner as Daniel spread Ashford's architectural blueprints on the desk. Robert studied them with the intensity of someone seeing prophecy confirmed, his finger tracing the red markings, reading the cryptic notations his grandfather had written decades ago. He actually did it, Robert said quietly. The stubborn old bastard actually hid his fortune in the structure. He looked up at Daniel. Here's what I propose. We search together, split what we find 60-40. I get the larger share because it was my grandfather's wealth, you get enough to make this worth your considerable effort and risk. 50-50 or I do it myself. You don't have time to do it yourself. Your ex-wife just gave you 1 week to prove stability, which you can't do while living in a condemned building searching for treasure that might not exist. You need money immediately, and you need help navigating the legal complications of treasure trove claims. Robert's expression softened fractionally. I'm not trying to rob you, Mercer. I'm offering partnership when I could just as easily destroy you through legal channels and code enforcement complaints. Daniel looked at his son, at the sleeping bags in the corner that constituted their current home, at the impossible situation he'd bought for $455. Robert Ashford had resources, connections, could probably smooth over complications Daniel didn't even fully understand yet. But partnership meant splitting the fortune, meant giving up control, meant trusting someone whose grandfather had been cunning enough to hide wealth for 70 years. 60-40 in my favor, Daniel said finally. My building, my discovery, my risk. Robert considered, then nodded. Agreed. But we start immediately. Every day that passes is a day closer to your custody hearing and environmental enforcement. They worked through the morning and into afternoon, following Ashford's blueprints to the marked locations. Daniel had been searching the cornerstone all wrong, looking at the stone itself when the clue said the cornerstone remembers industry. Robert suggested the washing equipment beside it, and when they examined the floor of the washing basin carefully, they found a section that sounded hollow when tapped. Prying up the flooring revealed a sealed metal container, and inside were stacks of currency, old bills that looked like they belonged in museums, and what appeared to be bearer bonds from the 1930s. Daniel's hands shook as he examined the currency. Hundreds of bills, maybe thousands, all pre-1950s denominations. Robert was already making calculations, pulling up currency collector databases on his phone. Conservative estimate, just the currency alone is worth $60,000 to $80,000 if we authenticate it properly. The bonds could be worth more. They found the second cache in the main processing floor, hidden inside one of the massive carting drums exactly as the clue suggested. Using crowbars and determination that bordered on reckless, they pried open an access panel to find another container, gold coins, dozens of them, pre-1933 double eagles that gleamed despite decades in darkness. By early evening they'd found 4 of the 9 caches, and Robert's running total had reached $300,000, possibly more depending on authentication and market conditions. Daniel's 60% would be $180,000, more money than he'd ever imagined having, enough to prove to any judge that he could provide for Ethan. But as they hauled the 4th container up from the basement, which had been partially flooded and reeked of mold and chemicals, Daniel noticed something he'd missed in his earlier excitement. Tucked into the container alongside the gold and bonds were documents, ledgers showing payroll records from the wool mill's operation. The ledgers documented systematic wage manipulation, workers paid half of what they'd earned, hours shaved from time cards, injury compensation denied through fraudulent claims. Decades of exploitation in Jonathan Ashford's meticulous handwriting, showing exactly how he'd accumulated the fortune he'd hidden. "What is it?" Robert asked, seeing Daniel's expression change. Daniel showed him the ledgers, watching Robert's face shift from curiosity to something harder to define. They sat in the contaminated basement surrounded by found treasure and documented theft, and the weight of what they'd discovered felt suddenly much heavier than gold. "We can destroy these," Robert said after a long silence. "The workers are all dead. Their families have moved on. Nobody benefits from reopening wounds from 70 years ago." But Daniel was thinking about his own grandfather, the man who'd worked textiles his whole life and died broke despite decades of labor, whose employer had probably kept ledgers exactly like these. About the workers whose names filled these pages, whose stolen wages had bought the gold coins and bearer bonds they'd been so eager to claim. "Your grandfather left something else," Daniel said, pulling out Ashford's journal and opening it to a page he'd noticed earlier but hadn't fully processed. An entry from 1954, year before he died. Robert read aloud, "To whoever finds my fortune, know that it was built on the labor of men I underpaid and the trust one betrayed. I tell myself business required such practices, that survival demanded ruthlessness. But at the end of my life, I wonder if wealth earned through exploitation can ever truly be enjoyed, or if it poisons everything it touches. The choice of what to do with this knowledge is yours. Use it wisely or use it poorly, but know that you cannot claim innocence about its source." They sat in silence, the ledgers spread between them like accusations, and Daniel understood that Jonathan Ashford had left more than treasure. He'd left a test, a question about whether someone desperate enough to search for hidden wealth was honest enough to acknowledge where it came from. "We still need the money," Robert said finally. "My grandfather's sins don't change the fact that you need to prove you can house your son, and I'd like to recover something from a property that's been bleeding my family dry for decades." "But we'd know," Daniel said. "Every time we spend it, we'd know it came from stolen wages. Every fortune comes from somewhere uncomfortable if you look hard enough. At least we're being honest about it." Daniel looked up at the ceiling, imagining Ethan sleeping in the office above them, trusting his father to make decisions that would shape his future. Dawn was starting to filter through cracks in the foundation, and in a few hours the county would post no-entry orders and Jennifer would file her custody petition. "There are 5 more caches," Daniel said, standing and wiping chemical water from his hands. "Your grandfather's blueprints show them. But one of them has a notation I didn't understand until now." He pulled out the plans, pointing to a location marked on the top floor. "It says, 'Where truth waits, the final choice reveals character.' I think he left something else up there, something that explains why he documented his own theft instead of destroying the evidence." They climbed through the wool mill as dawn broke over Maine, 2 men carrying treasure and guilt in equal measure, searching for answers that a dead man had left in a building everyone else had abandoned as worthless. And outside, a Mercedes and a beat-up car sat side by side in the parking lot, waiting to carry away either salvation or something much more complicated than either man was ready to face. The location marked where truth waits was in the building's top-floor storage loft, a space Daniel hadn't fully explored. They climbed through increasingly narrow passages, the air thick with wool dust that had settled over decades, and emerged into a space beneath the peaked roof where raw fleece had once been stored before processing. At the far end, beneath a section of intact roofing, sat a wooden chest bound with iron straps. Unlike the other caches, this one wasn't hidden. It sat in plain view, waiting, with an envelope propped against it bearing a single word in Jonathan Ashford's handwriting, conscience. Daniel opened the envelope while Robert examined the chest. Inside was a letter, dated August 1954, written in the shaky hand of a man who knew his time was ending. To the finder of my fortune, if you have come this far, you have found the gold and bonds and currency I hid throughout this building. You have also found, if you searched honestly, the ledgers documenting how I earned that wealth. The chest before you contains something more valuable than precious metals, the truth of what I built and what it cost. Inside you will find wage records showing what I actually paid versus what I should have paid, injury reports I falsified, and testimony from workers I silenced through threats and intimidation. You will find evidence that could, even now, bring civil claims against my estate and shame against my family name. I could have destroyed these documents. I should have. But at the end of my life, I find I cannot die without leaving some accounting of my sins, some possibility that they might be addressed by someone braver than I was. The fortune is yours if you want it. But so is the choice of what to do with this evidence. You can destroy it, as I nearly did, and enjoy the wealth without the weight of its origins. Or you can do something I lacked the courage to do, acknowledge the theft, seek out the descendants of those I wronged, and use the fortune to make what restitution is possible. I do not tell you which to choose. I only tell you that the choice will define you more surely than the wealth ever could. Jonathan Ashford Daniel read the letter twice, then handed it to Robert, who read it with an expression that moved from confusion to something that might have been grief or might have been relief. They opened the chest together and found exactly what Ashford had promised, decades of documentation showing systematic wage theft totaling, by Ashford's own accounting, over $2 million in current value. Jesus, Robert said quietly. He kept records of everything he stole. Daniel looked at the documents, at the names of workers whose families might still be in Maine, might still remember grandfathers who worked themselves to death in this building for wages that were half what they'd earned. He thought about his own grandfather, about the particular bitterness the old man had carried about textile work, about dying broke despite a lifetime of labor. What do you want to do? Robert asked. Before Daniel could answer, his phone rang. Jennifer's number. He answered, already bracing for another ultimatum. The school district called me, she said without preamble. Ethan wasn't enrolled anywhere. They're required to report educational neglect. Daniel, Child Services is involved now. I'm coming to get him today. Jennifer, wait, no more waiting. I'll be at that wool mill in 2 hours with Marcus and my attorney. You can hand him over voluntarily or we can involve the police. She hung up. Daniel sat heavily on the dusty floor, the weight of the past 5 days finally crushing down. Robert stood nearby, clearly uncertain what to say to a man watching his life collapse in real time. How much is my share worth? Daniel asked finally. Best estimate. Based on what we've found in current market values? $300,000 total, your 60% is $180,000. Enough to prove financial stability and then some. And if we tried to find the workers' descendants? Make actual restitution? Robert was quiet for a long moment. It would consume most of the fortune. Maybe all of it, depending on how many families we could locate and what a fair calculation would be. My grandfather's own accounting says he stole the equivalent of $2 million. We don't have enough to make full restitution. But we could try. We could acknowledge what happened and use what we have to at least partially address it. You'd be giving up the money that could save your custody situation. Daniel looked at the documents spread across the floor, at the evidence of theft that had funded the treasure he'd been so desperate to claim. He thought about Ethan sleeping downstairs, about what he wanted to teach his son about integrity and choices and what mattered when the world stopped being fair. There's another option, Robert said slowly. We take the fortune, but we establish a trust. Use it to create something that benefits the community Ashford exploited. Not direct restitution, which would be impossible to calculate fairly, but something that serves the descendants of the workers and acknowledges what was taken from them. Like what? The wool mill itself. We remediate it properly, but instead of selling it or developing it for profit, we turn it into something that provides opportunity. Job training center for textile trades, maybe. Affordable workspace for local craftspeople. Something that generates value for people who need it rather than extracting it from them. Daniel considered this, the idea taking shape. That would take most of the fortune just for environmental cleanup and structural repairs. Most but not all. You could keep enough to satisfy your immediate needs, prove to the court you're stable, and still do something meaningful with the rest. And you'd go along with this? Give up your 40% for a community project? Robert looked around the storage loft, at the building his grandfather had built on stolen wages. My family's been trying to walk away from this place for 40 years. Maybe instead of walking away, we should walk toward something. Use Ashford's ill-gotten wealth to create something he never had the decency to build, a legacy that actually benefits the people who made his fortune possible. They spent the next hour making calculations and phone calls. Robert had connections to economic development agencies and historic preservation funds. Daniel had nothing but desperation and a building full of tainted treasure. But together they sketched something that might work: liquidate the found assets, use 70% for proper environmental remediation and conversion to a workforce development center, split the remaining 30% between them. Daniel's share would be around $54,000. Enough to rent a house, pay Jennifer what he owed, buy time to find actual work. Not the fortune he'd imagined when finding Ashford's journal, but enough to prove he wasn't drowning anymore. When Jennifer arrived with her attorney and Marcus, Daniel met them in the parking lot. Ethan was with him, and Robert stood nearby with a briefcase full of documentation they'd prepared. "We're not doing this here," Jennifer's attorney began, but Daniel held up his hand. "I'm not fighting you. You're right that I haven't been able to provide stability. But I am now." He handed her bank documentation showing the deposit from his share of the liquidated assets, a signed lease for a house in town, and proof of enrollment for Ethan at the local school starting Monday. Jennifer examined the papers with obvious suspicion. "Where did this money come from?" "I found valuable assets in the building. Historical currency and bonds. Authenticated them with experts, sold them through proper legal channels with full documentation." Daniel gestured to Robert. "This is Robert Ashford. His grandfather built this wool mill and left assets hidden here. We've been working with attorneys to properly liquidate them and establish clear ownership." Marcus spoke for the first time, his lawyer voice assessing the situation. "And the building itself? It's still condemned. I signed a lease this morning. We move in this weekend. The wool mill is being remediated and converted to a workforce development center. I'll be managing the project, which provides employment and steady income." Jennifer's attorney examined the documentation, clearly searching for problems but finding none. The bank statements were legitimate, the lease was proper, and the employment contract with the newly established Ashford Workers Legacy Trust was legally executed. "Can I talk to you alone?" Jennifer asked Daniel. They walked toward the Kennebec River that ran behind the property. Jennifer stood looking at the water for a long moment before speaking. "I didn't want to take him from you. I wanted you to succeed." "I know. What really happened? 5 days ago you had nothing." Daniel considered how much truth to share. "I bought a condemned building with my last $400 because I was desperate. Found out the original owner had hidden assets throughout the structure. Enough that when we liquidated them properly, I got a share. Not enough to be rich, but enough to be stable. And you're using most of it for this workforce center? Most of it belongs to other people. The workers whose wages were stolen. The money came from that theft. Robert and I decided using it to benefit the community was better than just keeping it." Jennifer studied him, looking for the desperate edge that had characterized him for months. "You look different. Like you can breathe." "I can. First time in a year." She nodded slowly. I'm not withdrawing the petition entirely. But I'm not pursuing emergency custody. We'll work out a schedule. But Daniel, if you slip back. I understand. And thank you. The remediation took longer than projected, cost more than budgeted, and required Daniel to learn about environmental law and historic preservation. But the work was real, paid actual wages, and gave him purpose beyond survival. Robert became an unlikely partner, his business connections complementing Daniel's growing expertise in project management. They established a board for the Ashford Workers' Legacy Trust, including descendants of workers whose names appeared in the wage theft ledgers. The mission was simple: acknowledge the exploitation that had built Ashford's fortune, use that fortune to remediate the environmental damage, and create opportunities for the community that had been harmed. The assets sold for more than Robert's estimates. After remediation costs, they had enough to convert the building and establish an endowment for ongoing operations. Ethan turned 8 during the first year of remediation, celebrated his birthday in a building still under construction. Daniel watched his son navigate the wool mill with confidence, explaining its history to his classmates, learning lessons about integrity that couldn't be taught through words. The grand opening happened 18 months after Daniel had bought the wool mill for $455. 200 people attended, including descendants of workers Ashford had exploited, community leaders, and people who'd watched the building decay for decades. Daniel stood in the renovated main floor, surrounded by equipment that was now educational rather than abandoned, by spaces that would house job training and small manufacturing and educational programs. He felt the satisfaction that comes from building something that mattered. Robert found him near the memorial display, where visitors were reading Ashford's final letter and examining the wage theft documentation. Strange thing, making a monument to your grandfather's exploitation. Better than pretending it didn't happen, Daniel said. He left us that choice. You made it. I just followed. You could have fought me. Robert looked at his grandfather's portrait, displayed with full context. I spent my life proud of the Ashford name. Now I don't know what to be proud of. Be proud that you didn't hide it. That you helped build this. The Ashford Workers' Legacy Center opened with job training programs, affordable workspace, and educational programming. Revenue covered maintenance and supported operations, creating a sustainable model. Daniel took a position as center director, drawing a salary that covered expenses and rebuilt savings. The work was constant but meaningful, contribution is something that would outlast him. Jennifer's marriage to Marcus ended after 3 years. She moved nearby and the custody arrangement evolved into genuine co-parenting. She attended center events occasionally, supporting what Daniel had built. On the 2-year anniversary, Daniel stood in the storage loft where he'd found Ashford's final letter. The space had been converted to offices, the chest and documents now part of the museum display. Ethan was with him. Grandpa would have liked this, Ethan said. He talked about how mill owners cheated workers. Your great-grandfather worked textiles? Yeah. He didn't talk about it much, but I remember him saying the owners paid half what the work was worth. Daniel felt something settle. He descended to the museum and searched the wage theft ledgers, finding it: William Mercer, hired 1948, terminated 1954, wages owed, $3,247, amount paid, $1,638, stolen, $1,609. His grandfather. His own grandfather had been one of the workers Ashford systematically cheated. The fortune Daniel had found had been built partly on his own grandfather's stolen wages. He sat on a bench, the weight crushing down. Ethan found him, recognized the ledger entry, understood. So we gave back Grandpa's money to other people, Ethan said quietly. Some of it. Not all. Not enough. But you tried. You could have kept everything and Grandpa would never have known. But you tried to make it right. Daniel pulled his son close, understanding this was the lesson worth teaching. When faced with the choice between expedience and integrity, he'd chosen integrity even when it cost him. 5 years after buying the wool mill, Daniel received letters from descendants of workers whose names appeared in Ashford's ledgers. They'd learned about the center, visited, wanted to thank him for acknowledging what had happened and using the stolen wealth to create opportunity. The letters included photographs that Daniel added to the memorial wall, creating an archive that documented textile labor from perspectives rarely preserved. Robert stood with Daniel at the wall's dedication. "I think about my grandfather's letter. About that line where he said the choice would define us more than the wealth. He was right," Daniel said. "The money's mostly gone, spent on cleanup and programming. But what remains is this place and the choice we made." The center continued operating sustainably, serving the community that had been exploited to build it. Daniel turned 40 managing a building he'd owned for 8 years, surrounded by people building careers in spaces he'd helped create. On the 10th anniversary, Daniel stood at the river overlook, watching the Kennebec flow past. Ethan was in college studying nonprofit management, planning to return and help manage the center. The wool mill stood behind him, for stories of granite that had witnessed a century of industry and exploitation and transformation. The building breathed with morning activity, people arriving for work and training in spaces that had been toxic ruins when Daniel first walked through them with $455 and no plan beyond desperate hope. The fortune he'd found was gone, spent on remediation and programming and the constant cost of maintaining buildings in integrity. But what remained was structure, community, legacy built not on what he'd inherited but on what he'd chosen to do with that inheritance. Daniel understood what he'd bought for $455, not treasure or salvation but the opportunity to make a choice that defined him, to build something from ruins that acknowledged where it came from while reaching towards something better, to prove that legacy wasn't what you found but what you chose to carry forward and what you had the courage to transform. The river flowed toward the Atlantic, and Daniel Mercer stood watching it flow, understanding that buildings and rivers outlast their builders but carry the marks of human choices, and that sometimes the most valuable thing you can do with found treasure is acknowledge its cost and use it to prevent future harm, building something honest on a foundation of admitted wrong, teaching each generation that the measure of a person isn't what they find but what they choose to do with it once they understand where it came from and what it cost to create. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.